elves, one of the main staples of any fantasy world. Unlike science fiction, where every author seems to invent their own races, and they get stranger and stranger as time goes on, fantasy is really built on copying patterns from previous works, and especially Tolkien. Because the old chap invented the classics, humans and elves and dwarves and orcs, you see them in almost every fantasy world. And when you don't, it's because it's specifically a subversion. I think we all heard the Terry Pratchett quote. Tolkien has become a sort of a mountain, appearing in all subsequent fantasy in the way that Mount Fuji appears so often in Japanese prints. Sometimes it's big and up close, sometimes it's a shape on the horizon, sometimes it's not there at all, which means that the artist either has made a deliberate decision against the mountain, which is interesting in itself, or is in fact standing on Mount Fuji. And one of those pillars of fantasy that everyone copies is elves. But do you know what elves are particularly infamous for? All the bajillion varieties and subraces people always have to make up for their worlds. People joke there is about 19 different types, and sure enough, if you check D&D Beyond, there is a bunch of elf subraces. There's the classics, the high elves, the wood elves, the dark elves, but then it starts to get into far more specific variants. You see pallid elves and Airani elves and aquatic elves, but if you really look at all those subraces, if you really compare their cultures, you will quickly see that the vast majority of those are really superfluous. And after analyzing all the various subraces of elves in D&D and fantasy and fiction beyond, I've come to the conclusion that really there are only 4 types of elves. There could be 5, but I counted mostly only the 4. First, we need to talk about the originals, and I do not mean Tolkien, because we actually need to look beyond our Mount Fuji to the thing that inspired Tolkien in the first place, the Norse and Celtic mythology. When Tolkien first started inventing his world, it wasn't supposed to be its own world. Arda was Earth in a lost mythical age, and the stories were his way of giving England its own mythology, heavily inspired by his favorites, Norse and Celtic mythologies. And something they both had was a version of elves. The pre-Christian Norse believed in a race of little people they called Alfar. This is where the word elf comes from. Alfar had a lot in common with the fair folk. They were often short, they had mysterious magical powers, and they were usually hidden from plain sight, and muggles like us, either by just literally being invisible, or perhaps by living in some sort of alternate dimension where some said time flowed differently. They liked to sometimes kidnap children, then replace them with their own, because old-timey parents of neurodivergent children preferred to believe the child wasn't theirs, instead of loving them as they were. The elves of the ancient mythologies were one of the many gods of the gaps, the things people before modern science used to explain things they didn't understand. After you look at the examples most common in modern fantasy fiction, you will see that these really are different. Even on a superficial level, the mythical elves were often shorter than humans. It's getting very common to see modern fantasy elves be very tall, because we associate elves with so much with superiority, that they have to be superior in every way. Bigger, smarter, faster. The originals really were fairies. Small spirits of nature hiding in nooks and crannies, and most importantly, they were tricksters, having more in common with some kind of gnome or goblin in modern imagination. They were undoubtedly elves, the prototype. They are the original source of the concept, but they are not quite any of the other major categories. If somebody asked you to imagine an elf, you'd likely first think of this tall, beautiful creature with pointy ears, feeling smug and arrogant. Maybe they live in big ancient cities, hidden away somewhere in the mountains or the forests, and each of them lives a very, very long time. They were here before us, and though their civilization has waned, they remain, looking at humanity with a certain level of pity or disdain. These are your classical high elves, and they exist in almost every major fantasy setting. Though distinctions between types of elves in Tolkien are not as clear and not identical to these modern divisions, the main concept of the High Elves stems from the images of Rivendell and the elven population dispersed throughout Middle-earth. They created the modern image of this haughty, beautiful, superior race living in the remnants of their former glory as the short-lived, quick-breeding humans quickly outnumber them. Warcraft, of course, presents us with the High Elves. Before they got almost wiped out, the High Elves were literally the epitome of this trope. They were everything you could imagine from it. Then they almost all died, and almost all of the rest became Blood Elves, and then there were still somehow more of them coming up. Don't ask me how. The Blood Elves kinda became a variant of Dark Elves. More on that in their section, but nowadays the Blood Elves kinda swung back to the High Elf type. They revere paladins and shun dark magic and risky stuff, and became essentially High Elves who just really love wearing red. One of the more interesting types of High Elves to me are the Altmer of the Elder Scrolls. All elves on Tamriel look a little different, a little less human than you usually see. They're more gold-skinned and very tall, and they take those tropes of superiority and smugness and they take them to the extremes. The Altmer are racial supremacists, right down to eventually developing a sect with a very suspicious dress sense. I like them not because I like right-wing supremacists. I like them because they do not shy away from taking the basic ideas of High Elves and just really running with them. So many D&D settings have just standard High Elves that you don't really have to mention them individually. Every D&D writer feels obliged to just have High Elves somewhere. Because it's D&D, people will want to play High Elves. Forgotten Realms have Sun Elves and Moon Elves who have some visual and cultural distinctions, but when you really get into it, they are just individual cultures of High Elves. Eberron creates its own cultures of elves that try to go beyond these old distinctions, but in the end you see High Elves among them. And the 4th edition tried to do something different and made Eladrin into their replacement for High Elves. They try to return a little bit of that original fairy inspiration, but for the most part they remain true to being High Elves. And honorable mention goes to the Vulcans of Star Trek. They're technically not elves, and they are older than most modern versions of High Elves, and of course they're not in fantasy. But you can see how fantasy writers looked at Vulcans, and how much their demeanors influenced how High Elves developed later. Star Trek gave us almost as much of the elven tropes as Tolkien did, as much as Klingons would influence the development of orcs. The other major Tolkienian inspiration for elves in fantasy was a group of elves who refused to cross the Misty Mountains and remained largely living in the Mirkwood, sometimes called, in fact, Wood Elves. Again, Tolkien doesn't make the same modern distinctions, and they're technically the same species, just different cultures of it. But the things that made them distinct really resonated with fantasy writers. Where High Elves lived in their isolated cities, the Wood Elves preferred to stay in the forests. Be it by choice or by necessity, they get a little more primal and a little more dangerous, and sometimes they get painted more greenish colors on their skin as well as their clothes. Some people imagine Wood Elves as the hippie elves because trees, but really, they're more like survivalist elves. Elder Scrolls again goes really hard on those Wood Elf tropes. To not make them more tree-hugging hippies people imagine them as, Wood Elves are obligate carnivores, and they are in fact forbidden from consuming plant products, at least once from their home of Valenwood. They are subjects to the Green Pact, where if they kill something, they have to use every piece of it. And that extends to people, which means that if an orc invades their home and they kill the orc to defend themselves, they now have to eat that orc. And in Elder Scrolls Online, you can see their alcohol, that they call rot meth, a very friendly sounding name, which is produced from rotting meat, of course. Everything about them is produced from meat and leather. Something that may surprise people to see in this category is the Night Elves of Warcraft. I know people see the name and think, well, they're obviously Dark Elves, and too many people who know nothing about the lore actually call them Dark Elves, but they're not that close to the concept. True, if you look into the original concept art of Night Elves, they are heavily themed after Dark Elves, including a very matriarchal society originally, but half of those concepts didn't materialize in canon and the other half mellowed out over the years, and the end product, with their devotion to their forests and their quote-unquote savage nature, pegs them very hard in the Wood Elf category. Something that hits many of the major points of Wood Elves are the Ainshey, the Elves of the Witcher universe. Sapkowski goes also very hardcore on their backstory, but instead of making them cannibals, he makes them terrorists. Because you see, since the Witcher universe was supposed to be more gritty, the elves weren't just pushed out and shoved into the corners of the known world. They were pretty explicitly almost wiped out by a dedicated conquest campaign. There are elves who live in the cities, but they are a minority, and the remaining 3 elves live as terrorists and scavengers on the outskirts of human civilization. Dragon Age also has a very similar example. There are city elves who keep some ideas of high elves, but instead of being superior and smug, they're poor, they live in ghettos, and they very visibly malnourished. And their freakin', the Dalish elves, are very clearly a kind of wood elf, with a lot of similarities to the Scoia'tael of Witcher. The honorable mention here goes to the elves of Athos from Dark Sun. They can hardly be called wood elves with no woods to call home, but they share a lot of common tropes. Humans kind of ruined their planet and pushed them into living in the middle of nowhere, and much like most wood elves, they are survivalists, eking out an existence. Only, because it's Dark Sun, they also go very hardcore. They're raiders and thieves living in many nomadic tribes in the desert. One interesting bit that shows how hardcore they really are is, for example, it is dishonorable among elves to ride on an animal unless wounded and near death. Even pregnant women and old elves are expected to keep up with their tribe or be left behind. Though the original Norse myths had some form of dark elves or Svartalvar, it's not quite clear how much of an elf they were and if dwarves weren't supposed to be the same as dark elves. I won't dwell too much on it, but Tolkien didn't really do much with the dark elf concept. He did call a number of populations dark elves, but they weren't our modern concept of it. Tolkien's dark elves were a very technical distinction that had to do with their migrations to Valinor. It's a long story, I won't get into it here, but what Tolkien called the dark elves was definitely very far from Drow. So our idea of dark elves doesn't come from Tolkien. So where does it come from? And for once, we actually have D&D to thank for it. Though the concept of dark elves existing wasn't entirely original, as we've discussed, everything we really associate with them comes from Gary Gygax and the original TSR. They took the idea of the Norse dark elves living underground, which again may have been dwarves, and they just really ran with it. They created a matriarchal race of these evil underground elves with dark skin, worshipping demons and dark gods. And if you really get into their lore, even this basic D&D lore gets really hardcore. For example, someone at TSR thought, well, if the Drow are really that selfish and that evil, how come they have children at all? How come any female Drow ever bears the pains of pregnancy? Why would they ever subject themselves to so much pain for the sake of another person? And instead of saying, well, clearly they can't be that selfish because their race would go extinct very quickly, instead, somebody decided that Drow women are usually pregnant with multiple children. But Drow being Drow, the children murder each other in the womb, and those fights give the mother a sensation of pleasure far greater than any she got from, let's say, producing those children, to not trigger YouTube. Yeah, that's canon. That they are getting, quote unquote, excitement from their children killing each other in the womb. So often, when other settings try to create their version of Dark Elves, they usually have to go less hardcore. Tamriel's Dunmer, for example, are much more sociable. That doesn't mean they're nice. Anyone who has played Morrowind will know that Dunmer are so xenophobic they're even racist to other Dunmer, born outside of Morrowind. Which, shouldn't be surprising since humans are racist to other humans all the time, but it feels weird somehow with a fantasy race, until you get used to it. However, Dunmer are not matriarchal, and their religion is very unique. They did once worship the Daedra, the kind of demons of Elder Scrolls, and then they worship them again, but there is a lot of nuance there that any demon worshippers like Drow don't usually get. Honestly, Dunmer are one of my favorite races in fantasy because they really are a unique mix of elements, and their dark elfness is somewhat superficial. Warcraft, as I already stated before, tried to make a subversion of Dark Elves in their Night Elves. The original concept art makes them very matriarchal, very quote-unquote savage, but as I already stated before, a lot of those edges either didn't materialize or got sanded off in time. Instead, Warcraft went far deeper into the Dark Elf territory with the Nightborn and the Legion expansion. Instead of hiding underground, they hide under a bubble in their city, which still blocks sunlight and changes their appearance. They're not really matriarchal, but women do seem to have a greater role in their society than men, which really shows Blizzard playing into those Dark Elf tropes more strongly. And of course, if we're talking about Dark Elves in Warcraft, we can't forget about the Blood Elves. Much like most examples of Dark Elves, the Blood Elves used to be High Elves, but they are descended from High Elves, and then they are corrupted in some way. They grow desperate to remain in power that they lost after falling from their old glory. And for a while, Blood Elves were half of an example of a typical Dark Elf. Again, they weren't matriarchal, but they were kind of evil. They didn't wear dark skin, they didn't live underground, but there was a little bit of a Dark Elf thematic. And eventually the sun was reignited, and after all those years now in Midnight, Blood Elves are just pretty much just High Elves in the red, as I mentioned before. Out of the D&D settings, Eberron really tries to do something different with their Dark Elves. Though they call them Drow, and they do look like Drow, they don't live underground, but instead live in the jungles of Zendrik. They used to be slaves of the giants until they rebelled, and now they are mostly a tribal culture. But they're not matriarchal either, so by large they almost seem like they mostly fit into the Wood Elf tropes, despite their appearance. They are, however, an interesting twist, like most things on Eberron. A lot of the different varieties of elves in D&D and other fantasy settings fall into a broad category of elves who live in X. Sea elves or snow elves, for example, and though it may seem like they would really be their own category, when you really get into their lore, however much of it there is, they don't really strike out on their own. The default Sea Elves don't give you much lore, but in the Forgotten Realms they have reclusive cities hidden within kelp forests. They are noble and mostly peaceful, with a reliance on families and clans, and they feel superior to others, teaching other underwater cultures how to cultivate seaweed. In the end, by most measures, they seem to be just High Elves underwater. So if you need them for gamey reasons, to have a race that has underwater breathing, sure, make them a separate elf subrace. But conceptually, they're not really that far away from High Elves. Forgotten Realms also has the Avariel, the Winged Elves. And sure, mechanically and biologically they are different because they have wings, but let's look at their culture and their lore. There used to be much more of them. They are now nearly extinct and very reclusive, and live in isolated cities where they hide from the humans that nearly wiped them out. Yep, they're high elves, but they fly now. Finally, the last major example I can think of, which is to say it's not very major in its setting, is the Snow Elves of Elder Scrolls. We don't see a lot of them, the intact original Snow Elves we see being one dude who doesn't come up on Detect Life or Detect Undead and is impossibly old, becoming extremely suspicious, and another dude who is explicitly a vampire. The rest of them got kind of a short end of the stick because they basically turned into Morlocks from the Time Machine. And if you look into what we see of their culture, their architecture, their reverence for Auriel, they once again seem very high elven in many regards. They just live in snow. What I think is a type of elves that we don't really see but we could still fit into the general elven themes is what I'd call Iron Elves or War Elves of some kind, name not final. Taller and physically stronger, they still have that elven sense of superiority and powerful magic, but they don't live in isolated cities or hide out in the woods. No, these elves decided, screw those humans, we're better. And they live in these rampaging semi-nomadic hordes that conquer and destroy human cities. While it may seem very orcish in some regards, unlike orcs, these guys don't worship evil gods. They're not chaotic, they're not tribal, they have a strict clan hierarchy, and they have a strict military organization and determined goals. They are elves in many regards, only different from what you see in most settings. Just about the only elves I can think of that would fit this paradigm in some ways are the Wild Hunt or the NL from The Witcher, which again shows you how unique and underappreciated that setting is. Well, I think that's most of the distinct types of elves I can think of. Do you think I missed any types? Maybe you can think of any specific examples of any of the types that you especially enjoyed in a setting I didn't mention. Or maybe you think I shouldn't have categorized one of the specific examples in these broad categories, and they really should be their own thing. If you know any good examples of that, do let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you enjoyed this particular over-analysis of fantasy tropes, I hope to see you next time.